So me and Jazza are going to have a debate now on the topic that Jack Wiltshire has brought up in the last week about who should be allowed to play for the England football team, what defines someone's nationality, and particularly with regards to sport.
Jack Wiltshire has suggested that just being here for 5 years and then becoming British because of residency is not enough for you to qualify to be an English football player for the England team. I am going to be arguing against that point, that people should be able to play for England if they have residency and citizenship, and Jimmy is going to be taking the contrary.
Yes, I'm going to be arguing that you have to either be born here or you have to live here a very, very long time to qualify to play.
So how long would you qualify as a long time? 5 years?
Is 5 years a long time?
It's a decent amount of time.
Well, if we take, he said two things. First off, he said that Adnan wasn't English because he'd lived here for 5 years, which I think is true. I think if you spend the first 20 years of your life in one country and move to another and stay there for 5 years.
But if he's got citizenship, he's technically.
No, I'm going to take the citizenship question as a separate thing. So the first thing I think he said was correct, that your nationality in terms of your manner, I guess, in terms of your
identity.
Yeah, your cultural identity is separate from your citizenship. But in terms of international football, the whole idea behind international football is that you take the best players from a particular country, and in the case of the UK, the 4 different bits that make up this country, and then you take the best players and then you field a national team against every other national team. And the current system that we have has sort of allowed, particularly in Olympics, people who were born outside the country to come in and...
But they all have to be British citizens or English citizens, no?
That's true, but
so are they, before somebody is able to play for the England team, do they have to pass a special Englishness test? Is that how you're going to be able to define it? Because otherwise discrepancy would come up about people like Mo Farah and James Froome and Kevin Peterson, who are all foreign-born sportsmen but who represent our country, and I'm sure that a lot of people would be sad to see those people leave our national team.
To be fair, about Mo Farah, he spent the first, 5 or 6 years of his life in, was it Somalia? Is that right? And then he moved over here. He spent the majority of his formative years in this country. So I think that is a different case from what we have here, where Adnan spent the majority of his formative years, almost the entirety of his formative years, arguably, in a separate country, and now he's moved over to here.
That's Adnan Januzaj, who was mentioned by Jack Wiltshire as an example, because he would be able to qualify as a player for the England team by the 2018 World Cup. And he's also, because of his heritage, he'd be able to play for Belgium, he'd be able to play for Turkey, for Serbia. But doesn't that just show the kind of world that we live in? Lots of people come from different roots, and so have very spread out identities.
Yeah, but it's one thing if you're the son of an Italian and Italian mum, French dad, or whatever, and then you can play for both of those teams. But it's another thing that if you move to a new country that you didn't spend your early life in, you just moved there, you've lived there for 5 years, which admittedly is quite a long time.
But if he wants to play for the England team, I'd assume that he would feel English.
As far as I'm aware, he hasn't actually expressed an interest in playing for the
He hasn't. But if he were to play, he'd have to give up the opportunity to play for all of those other teams that he could represent.
Sure.
If he's chosen England as the country that he wants to represent on an international stage, shouldn't we welcome that? Isn't that part of what the English psyche is like now? We welcome people in from other parts of the world.
It's certainly what the British psyche is like, which is a bit different from the English kind of thing. But the idea of cultural kind of integration, immigration, I think is a separate issue. I'm not saying, if he spends the next 40 years of his life here, I think by then he would be English, to be honest with you.
Yeah, but we can't wait that long. He's going to be retired by then.
But if you look at it from another point of view, do you not think that the Belgian national football team has a better claim on him than we do? If you're going to flip the question entirely on its head.
Yeah, but then it's his individual choice.
Sure, but it's still.
And don't you think that it's actually of all of the teams that he could potentially play for, England is by far the most competitive country for him to become a part of.
I'm sure, but that hasn't stopped, other players, particularly, Ryan Giggs could have played for England and chose to play for Wales. So they don't necessarily footballers don't tend to pick teams that are necessarily better, although Messi is actually an exception to that. Couldn't he play for Spain?
I don't know, he's only ever played for Argentina.
I'll have to leave that aside then, but Spain and Argentina, it's a pretty good choice compared to Belgium and England. But,
I was really worried where you going with that. Spain, Argentina, pretty much the same, right? Falklands, Gibraltar.
If I'd said England, Australia, pretty much same country, would that have been offensive?
Yeah, probably. But don't you think that this is only going to become more and more complicated? There's I can't remember for the life of me the name, but there's a German tennis player who now represents Germany, but used to represent Jamaica.
He used to actually play for Jamaica.
He used to play as a Jamaican player,
right, yeah.
And it's slightly different because it's less selective. It's more on an individual basis, and then the flag that you fly behind you is kind of like a side note. But as somebody's own identity, and if they choose to identify as a player from that country as an English player, who are we to say that he cannot do that?
Well, is he English? If I chose, assume I was good at football, and I chose to say, well, I identify as a Nigerian person.
Yeah, but then where do you draw the line? At what point do you say,
you have
you've been here for
you have
however
to draw the
long?
line somewhere, surely. Otherwise, it does become.
Yeah, and the FA has said that 5 years is enough for him to play for the English team, and that is true for all.
I'd still look at it from the point of view of the national clubs. Particularly if you allow a football player to play for whichever country they reside in, you would get an accumulation of players in particular teams. Does it not make for a more interesting international sport if it's more limited? So that he if he wants to play for a team, he has to play for Belgium or Turkey or whichever.
So how is
he?
How is Jazza? How is he going to decide which? Who do you think that he should play for then?
I don't know his history all that well. I know that he spent the first 20 years in Belgium. Is that right?
Yeah,
and then he moved here. And
18 years in Belgium.
And then he spent 5 years here. So I'd say Belgium has a better claim on him if you want to look at it from that point of view.
But if he doesn't want to play for Belgium.
Well, it can't be. It can't be purely a matter of personal choice.
If he ends up feeling more English than Belgian because he's chosen to live here, and yes, granted, he's chosen to live here because we pay much higher wages to our footballers than Belgium. But if he's chosen to make this country his home, then why shouldn't he?
After 5 years, I don't think you could say you were more English than Belgian.
But you're saying that there should be a cut-off point, and that's been decided as the cut-off point.
There has to be because it's a rule, and you can't just.
So where would you put the cut-off point then? You agree there should be one. So where would you put it?
if you spend, assume that you had a French player who spent the first, a guy who is ethnically French, who spends the first.
How are you ethnically French?
It's arbitrary, but just run with it, all right. And you spend the first 20 years of your life in France. I think that's you should end up playing for France then. If there's no other obviously there are players who have far more complicated histories than that. But I think in a way the national team that has the best claim to him should have first dibs.
But then what? But you're saying that the country should decide who he plays for.
Well, it's a national team, isn't it?
So he could get the call up and then say no.
Well,
so what? So if Belgium called him up and they said we want you to play for us, and then he says no, is he allowed to play for England?
No, he isn't. He's only allowed to play for different countries if they pass up on him. That's the way I'd probably do it.
Well, okay. Who do you think won that debate? Because we're going to start having a tally, and I'd quite like to win. So say that I won down below in the comments.
That's a better argument. So.
It's false. So let us know what you think about this. Should foreign players be able to play for England? At what point does a player become English, and at what point do they have the right to play for a certain country? And across any sport as well. Yeah. Say goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
We used to drink bottle gins and the world out of sea. Meet the trees and unsuch bar. We used to dance, so take a chance. chance. I lost my mind.